that I am late, but without any further ado, I would like to start my presentation. It is themed on the Second World War period of time and covers the topics of censorship, on active service, HMS Persuavent of the Falkland Island Garrison, privileged mail, special treatments, airmail and its beginnings, and Operation Tabarin. On the subjects of questions, I suggest we leave these to the end of my presentation. So let us begin. The first subject was the censorship, and my first slide of postal history is one from 1914. I know we said it would be a World War II presentation, but we have to start somewhere, and I believe this to be one of 4 of the earliest known censor items censored in Stanley. It originated from Punta Arenas and travelled to Stanley aboard the Almirante Goni, a whaler, at the time just after the Battle of Coronel. And there was a certain amount of hesitation about the prudence of the voyage, and there was concern whether or not the whale catcher would get through to Stanley. In the event, she did, and she carried 4 items of particular mail, all 4 of which bear the similar censor marking and have passed into the philatelic market this century. So World War I from Stanley. Another World War I censored in Egypt, originating from Stanley, I believe to be unique. Quite difficult to find something censored from the World War period that is associated with the Falkland Islands. I have had the marking checked, and I have information provided to me as shown on the slide, type and period of use. A nice item. So now let's get on to the Second World War period of time. This tells us about the arrangements put in hand by the governor by proclamation dated the 25th of August 1939. He appointed J. Hamilton as the censor. Arrangements were made to generate opened by censor labels, which were printed in the government printing office in Stanley. And later on, aspects of censorship for Garrison Mail was undertaken by the Garrison Censor Office. Likewise, in respect of HMS Persuavent, undertaken by Royal Naval Censorship. Operation Tabarin again had its own censorship of mail, undertaken usually by the leader, the base leader of the various stations. Should, as happened, any Royal Naval ship visit Stanley, then it managed its censorship. And these arrangements lasted until cancelled by proclamation, almost exactly 6 years later, 2 days short of 6 years after the original proclamation. So let's have a look at some examples. This is an unusual one. It is mail from the governor to Yorkshire, and as he was the commander-in-chief, and providing he signed the back of his envelope, as you can see he did, then it was exempt from censorship. So censorship period, but not censored. An example of the locally printed labels opened by censor, which appear in 2 spacings, narrow at 75 millimeters long and the wider version at 84 millimeters. This is from 1944, a commercial item into the well-known Dun and Bradstreet Company in Buenos Aires. I move on. I find this strange giving a Zoom presentation. I get absolutely no feedback from anybody, quite difficult at times, so you have to have the courage to plough on and hope I am entertaining you. Here we are, further examples of censorship to the well-known company, booksellers in London, Alfred Wilson, and fairly standard item from 1940, early in the war year, censored, probably in England with the usual PC90 tape. A nice item, it's fairly straightforward and typical of the period. So let's have a look at our second category, related to censorship indeed, called on active service. Provided any member of Her Majesty's forces at the time during World War II was overseas on active service, providing OAS was written somewhere on the envelope or on active service in full, then there was no charge for that item of mail to pass through the mail system. The first that I am showing is from a Royal Marine, Reginald Medley, who served on HMS Exeter, and this reached London in the middle of November and has been censored, the small HMS censorship marking applying in the top right-hand corner. The timing of when this item was posted in Stanley is estimated at 6 weeks prior to the London's marking, and we can find out from the work that I have done, and you may have read in the Upland Goose, that this item of mail had been collected at sea by HMS Ajax, another ship of the group of four that formed a hunting group seeking out the German battleship. And Ajax, having collected the mail from other HM ships at sea, made her way to Stanley and handed over the bags of mail round about the 12th of September, when she called into Stanley for a brief visit. So that is compatible with SS Livonia leaving Stanley on the 7th of October, and 6 weeks later, here we are arriving in London. So that appears to be kosher, a nice item. Now this will come close to the heart of James Grist if he's watching, because he has helped considerably in trying to gain an understanding of the Simons correspondence, this being one of about a dozen items that I now know about. Similar HMS Exeter marking as on the previous, and underneath that marking are the initials JL of the censor. To date, that has not been tied to an officer aboard HMS Exeter from the listings of the crew, incomplete, that I have found on the internet. Simons, we believe now to be a humble seaman, George Simons, who is believed to have been serving in the HMS Exeter during the Second World War. We have been unable to find his service record on the internet to confirm that he served on Exeter from that point of view. We also have the historic belief that the Simons was a shipwright, can't think what I want to say, but we now have established that it is unlikely that Simons was the author, because we know that he was on HMS Exeter at her next commission, which took place after she had returned to the UK after the Battle of the River Plate. After the Battle of the River Plate, the crew was paid off, and for a period of time while she was repaired, there was no active crew associated with the ship until she was recommissioned and sent out to the Far East, where she was sunk by the Japanese. And the aforementioned Simons survived both the sinking of Exeter and being a prisoner of war held by the Japanese. And it is very, very unlikely that he will have served on the two commissions, the first being at the beginning of World War II and the second round about 1942. So we discard that gentleman as being the source of the mail, and we now believe it's the seaman, George Simons. And I thank James considerably for finding this picture of the said George on the internet. We have also found a photograph postcard of the Hotel in Teignmouth, to which all the correspondence is addressed, as is shown in the top right corner. And this is another example, in this case with the large HMS Exeter censor marking. And this really is a nice piece, because underneath it, the censor initials that you can see are no less than Frederick Secker Bell, the captain of the Exeter. In parallel, I now move on to HMS Persuavent, another military organisation active in Stanley from the period shown at the top of this slide. It was a Royal Naval shore establishment, and it was the practice of the Royal Navy to give those establishments a similar sounding title as that given to a ship. So HMS Persuavent was a Royal Naval shore-based establishment in Stanley. And this item of mail is from a certain Anson, L. Anson, who has given all his details on the back of this envelope, tying him to the wireless telegraphy station at the Falkland Islands. A nice piece with a typical Royal Naval tombstone cancel at the bottom. Again, there is no date of postmark on this, but we believe it to be around about 43, but we can't be absolutely certain. We have been unable to read the name of the censor. Another rather unusual item from HMS Persuavent, again, very helpfully in this case, the flap stating it came from HMS Persuavent and was dated the 23rd of May 43. Very helpful, but it had a somewhat traumatic journey in reaching Great Britain. As we can see, it arrived in a damaged situation, meriting the hand stamp damaged by seawater. To date, we've been unsuccessful in identifying on what ship this piece of mail got damaged by seawater. So we can't say whether it was storm or enemy action or even a torpedo that might have caused this. But we know the marking was contemporary with other items of mail originating from South America at that time. Onward. Argentina played a nominally neutral role during the Second World War, and there were a number of organizations founded in Buenos Aires that were very pro-British and tried to serve the wider needs of Britain in a wartime situation. This censored cover, as you can see, is wonderfully entitled to the chairman of the British Women's Patriotic Committee in the Argentine. Very noble. I don't suppose anybody would want to join an organisation with a name like that in today's politics, but it was acceptable in the 40s. We know it left Stanley shortly after the 18th of August and arrived by reading the back transit marking of the 9th of September. So far, unable to say by which ship she travelled, my suspicions is that it was a Royal Naval ship, because it was not always the practice for the movements of such Royal Naval ships to be entered into the log of Stanley Harbour ship movements. One of 4 known covers with this larger HMS Persuavent censor marking. There is another similar marking, a smaller version of which this is an example, conveniently with the name of the censor shown below, one H.B. Williams of HMS Persuavent. And this is somewhat later, in the closing months of the year, date stamped in April 45, and we know that that was taken by Fitzroy, leaving Stanley for Montevideo on the 30th of April, where the mail bags for Argentina, Buenos Aires, would have been offloaded and probably carried up by ship up the River Plate to Argentina. That's compatible with a receipt date of the 7th of May, as shown on the flap. Continuing similar other military themes for the Falkland Islands, we come to the topic of the Garrison. The Garrison arrived in 1942, August time, and lasted until January 44. And we know it was drawn from the West Yorkshire Regiment and supporting units, and there are a number of correspondence that have survived from that period. What I did not know until I did some research is what was the driving force, firstly, for generating the Garrison. Why was it thought necessary? And then why was it closed? It was thought necessary because of the expansion of Japan early in the war, and the Falkland Islands servicing shipping movements around the bottom of South America. It was felt that invasion of Stanley was highly likely. However, it never happened. And when the military organisation in London, the cabinet came to the conclusion that the invasion was unlikely as Japan began to collapse as the second part of the war unfolded. It was then decided that the Garrison should return to the UK. This example, a nice item, was the slightly less common censor marking 3023. Again, we have the signature at the bottom left corner here of the censor, and all the details of the sender are neatly listed at the top left. A neat item, so we can thank Staff Sergeant Arthur Jones for sending it and letting it go into the telemarket. Apologies for the phone. Can you kill it, please, Mary? Another item of Garrison mail with the other marking. Just put a red button on it. Kill it. Wonderful. Thank you. As we have said with all of this military mail, this one is clearly marked on active service at the top. There is never any date or any source indication from where it originated, but we know by the censor marking and the name, and I don't think so in this particular case there's any information on the back. We know this is a Falkland item from the Garrison period, a nice commercial item to the Radio Society of Great Britain, and the censor, W.P. Sandeman, is well known censoring Garrison Mail. A nice item. I think this is the last. 1943, so right in the middle of the Garrison period. We know who sent it because it's all on the flap. So clearly an item to the Falkland Islands, but we don't know when it arrived because there is no receipt date marking. This is the signature here of the censor. I think that's all I'm going to say about that one. Privilege mail. This is quite a rare descriptor that you can apply to mail from the Falkland Islands. There are not very many circumstances to which you can give privileged mail considered a fair description. In this case, it is accurate because it applies to prisoner of war mail. This cover originated in South Africa, and from the flap we know it was written by the third wireless officer, Gunter Krebs, from the pre-war to period liner SS Usukoma. We know that she was taken over early on at the beginning of the war by the German Wehrmacht and became a supply ship for other German ships down in the South Atlantic. We know that she had left Germany laden, and we knew that she had reached the port on the northern coast of Argentina round about November 1939, at the height of the chase to find the German battleship Ross Bay. In short, she decided to leave and make her way north in the direction of Montevideo, and her departure from port was reported and found its way to the Admiralty in the UK, who instructed Ajax and Cumberland to divert from their intended area of search for the battleship and go and seek out this Usukuma and intercept her, which they did. However, the Germans decided they would not allow any Royal Naval boarding party and chose to scuttle the ship, forcing the Royal Navy to rescue the crew from the surface of the water, which they did. Amongst the crew rescued was this Gunter Krebs, and he was taken to Stanley for internment. And at one of my earlier visits to the Jane Cameron archives, I found all the correspondence, including the letter written to the governor in German, which had been inside this cover when sent. Essentially, he wanted the governor to make the Royal Navy return the various items that were confiscated from him when he was rescued from the sea and taken on board the Royal Naval ship. Amongst the things that the Royal Navy deprived him of was his camera, and we can all appreciate why. I don't think he ever got his camera back, and I've been unable to establish if he survived the war at the internment camp in South Africa. So something more to find out. It's a rather unusual item, possibly unique in Falklands postal history. A second example of privileged mail, the Falklands part of the British Red Cross Society was granted the concession of free postage for its correspondence internally within the Falkland Islands, provided that the envelope carried the local branch hand stamp applied in red ink, which it does, but in this case it's on the back. We know the date of its sent, March 44, just before the fire in April, and we know all about Madge Biggs and the role that she played in the service canteen and managing the Red Cross throughout World War II. Unusual item, not many of this marking known. I think this is one of the few items from my South Georgia exhibit that I have included in this presentation to you, but I thought it had a natural association with the earlier cover, as this is addressed to the Red Cross in the United States in Washington. A nice commercial piece, quite difficult to find the threepenny rate from South Georgia during the war, as there was very little correspondence outside of to Argentina, to elsewhere in the world. But this is a nice commercial item into the United States. Sent, cancelled on the 18th of February, and we know that the mail ship was the Sudarai, bound for Curacao. I guess oil, one way or another, may have been the reason for that route. And we see it was examined on South Georgia and by the Americans with their tape applied after censorship. A nice double censorship item from late in the World War II. I think I'm doing fairly well on time. I now move to special treatments. Another, I believe, unique item from the World War II period of consignees' mail. You can see the clear hand stamp across the top. Unfortunately, the stamp has not been cancelled, but I believe it to be, from the research I've undertaken, to have been sent in October 41, tying it to the visit of Fitzroy to the whaling station at Leith, presumably taking materials, cargo of some nature. So a unique piece, one I like. Another cover with an unusual hand stamp is this, from around about February 40, when it was sent to Norway from the agent of the whaling company in Stanley, and had been censored and reached London, waiting for the last stage of its journey up to Norway. At that time, Germany had invaded and overrun Norway, occupied it, and it was obviously impractical for the Royal Navy or anybody else to support the movement of mail from Great Britain to Norway any longer. And in consequence, it was stamped, postal services suspended, as you might expect, sender. So travelled halfway around the world twice and never got to its destination. Rather sad, really. There are a number of covers like this one. This has not been passed through the postal service. This is cancelled with a little cross on it, which you can just make out over the swan here. And the research was done some time ago as to why was it so cancelled, what was the circumstances behind the routing of the mail to merit such treatment. Well, I've set out with the questions that I've just posed. They were raised by Carl Roman and answered by WWII, the Foxby postmaster, for the early part of the war up to 1944. Essentially, as Fitzroy passed around the settlements after leaving Fox Bay, but before reaching Montevideo, mail would be picked up for onward transshipment to England, and clearly they did not go back to Fox Bay to get it cancelled, and action was taken by the captain, whose name I can't remember at the moment, who was responsible for censorship of the mail and cancellation of the stamp on the mail. Quite unusual, not many exist. Not far from where I live, here in Camberley, a few miles down the road is the village of Odium, and that is the house to which it was sent. Here is another example of similar mail. In this case, it's philatelic if you consider the addressee, but it's commercial in other reasons. Okay, again, we're talking about West Falkland, and we can tie the handwriting of the date on the stamp, 8th of November 43, to this item here, which was quietly given to me, which was given to Pebble Island when they'd loaded on 74 bales for shipment. I think to Montevideo, but I'm not certain where, but it was shipped aboard the Fitzroy. As you can read here about Captain Keith Pitt of the Fitzroy, appointed censor, and he marked any uncancelled mail. In this case was the date, I should have said the 18th of November 43, the next day after the picking up from Pebble Island. Naturally ties the two together. Not many of them. I haven't seen another one. I think this is the last of special treatments. Quite an unusual item, originating from Chile, and this is addressed to the Income Tax Commissioners in Port Stanley. But it is routed quite clearly into Montevideo. And why would you want mail addressed to an organisation in Stanley sent to Montevideo? Why not send it correctly straight through to Stanley? Well, the answer to that was that you ran the risk, if you were having your mail pass through Argentina, which would happen between Chile and Falkland Islands, and you ran the risk of random politically inspired delay for no obvious reason. But if you could route it apparently not to the Falkland Islands, in this case to Montevideo, then you would avoid all that disturbance. And that's what's happened in this case. And the agent, Clayton Stapleton, knew what to do, They gave it to the Fitzroy's captain and said, when you get to Stanley, would you please deliver that to the addressee? All you could be assured then was that your correspondence stood a far better chance of reaching the destination and not being subject to serious delay. I haven't seen another of that period requesting such service, but I have later ones in my collection in the birds period. I now move to entertain you with a little bit about the airmail from the Falkland Islands, and I thought I'd best start one of the earliest known airmail items flown in the Falkland Islands. One of 6 covers known, typically with the tuppenny rate from the centenary issue overprinted by a small hand stamp reading airmail. All 6 covers known have the same date, the 30th of November 34, and the story is explained with this extract from the local newspaper of the time, the Penguin, explaining the pleasures of flying to San Carlos down here, and some of the reasons of the seaplanes and what they were doing is explained here. So this gives a wonderful background to the story of these 6 covers. You can read more about it in the article that I think is to appear in the coming Up and Goose. Another early airmail, in this case inward to the Falkland Islands, originating from southern Rhodesia. A nice item. I now know it to be correct rate, particularly unusual rate of 4 and 11 pence. As is explained here, 11 pence got it to Germany, and the Zeppelin rate to Stanley, or Montevideo, and then on to Stanley was a further 4 shillings, so it's correctly rated with all the expected markings. I have seen no other like it. I believe it to be unique, and as we can see from the arrival date stamp, transit time was approximately a month. An unusual item. HMS Exeter and HMS Ajax appear quite frequently in the history of postal history of the Falkland Islands in the 1930s, the latter half. Both the 2 cruisers went to Grytviken, and whilst at Grytviken they exercised their seaplanes, typically one as shown in this upper right. Quite an experience watching one of those being launched, given this is 80 years ago or some such period of time. It looks awfully crude, and you do have to sort of say a prayer before you start each of your catapult launches. This particular item was picked up at Stanley, at Fox Bay, and flown into Stanley, hence a nice cancellation on the back, and the stamp was cancelled 17th of November. A small number of these are known, 3, and they're not so common now. Another one of 5 with a different marking here, as is shown on the front, all to do with the movement of mail, typically from West Falkland to East Falkland, and flown by the seaplane from HMS Exeter. This is from her 1938 visit. We still are showing covers from the period prior to 1944, when airmail services began in the Stanley for services to the UK and the rest of the world. This is another inward item, sent shortly after the arrival of the garrison, and because of the presence of the garrison with a lot of troops coming from England on the island, arrangements were made for an airmail service to apply from Great Britain to the Falkland Islands. As we read here, there was a notice saying that the service was available. The charges were 3 and 6pence for the all the way by air. There were essentially two options. The journey from England to the Falkland Islands was a two-hop journey. One to cross the Atlantic, which you could or could not fly, could be by sea, and the second was within the Americas down to Montevideo, which the service expected you to use. So you either had an air or a ship-air service. This is air all the way at the 3 and 6 half-times rate, censored, so it fits nicely into this presentation on 2 counts. The rate is matched to the extra threepence paying for the registration. You can't talk about the Falkland Islands and postal history for the Second World War without mentioning at some time or other Carl Loma. Nice picture of him top right. I met him when I went to New Zealand. We had an evening with him. He was a very sharp cookie in those days, a great loss when he passed away. And much may exist that one way or another he has had a finger in its generation. This one is addressed to him from a London stamp dealer. It's a postcard at another unusual rate of 1 and 7pence. Again, it is a correct rate by the North Atlantic Air Service, so all air all the way. But sadly for Carl, it got redirected to Darwin in Argentina before it was redirected to the Falkland Islands. And we know it eventually arrived there on the 28th of December. But the flight time down to Darwin, Argentina was 13 days, so we know it flew. A nice item. We're now into the later parts of 1944, when the Stanley Post Office accepted items for airmail to the UK and elsewhere in the world at the heavy rate of 3 and 6pence for 5 grams. Quite unusual for a pounds and ounces country to accept mail in grams, but that was because it was flown from Montevideo, having travelled from Stanley to Montevideo by ship, and it was the air service from Montevideo that controlled the prices. I've chosen this one. It's not a first day. It's a nice commercial item to a manufacturer of motorcycles, to which shown at the top, which didn't last very long. It was taken over in 1947. A nice commercial item. I wonder what the request was. I'm now moving over towards the end of this presentation, where I'm going to have a few slides from Operation Tabarin. We see quite a lot of this. I think this is a slide you may not have seen. It was posted in England by Fram himself when in transit out from London on the the Bransfield, of course, which was their first choice. But soon after leaving London, they knew they were in trouble because she took on too much water. She clearly wasn't fit for purpose. She had heavy leaks, and so they did not complete the journey south further than the Channel and had to go into port, unload, and arrange for all the materials to be taken down to Stanley by another ship. So this is from the period of when Bransfield was sailing out of London down to Plymouth, I think, where she ended the voyage. So this was then landed and treated as maritime mail, having been censored on board, and it is one of the few items from the Operation Tabarin team en route south. A couple of Tavern official proving mail, one from Graham Land and the other from South Orkneys. These were posted from the base post offices once established to a predetermined list of addressees. The intent was to retain them by the British government because the world accepts and you can have an effective territory if it has a mail system. So we are talking about parts of the Falkland Island dependencies of the time, Graham Land and South Orkneys, demonstrating the British right to operate the place because it was their territory, and the post offices was an example of this establishment of a government and operation in that territory. A few more. Nice picture up on the right of James Marr talking to the governor, and the cover chosen is from Marr to the Excellency with a report written in the early days of the base at Graham Land, and you can read the full report because it's held now in Kew, and I have a copy of it, but I have not shown it in this presentation. Nice item. Obviously double rate because of the weight and detail of the report. Another example of Operation Tabarin Censor Mail. You can't completely see it, but you can see the first censor marking was the tombstone undertaken at the base, and then you can just begin to see up here that there is a black shadow. You can see examine again coming through, but there are in fact two labels, tapes here, one on top of the other, very exactly as is described here. So this is a piece of mail that has been censored no less than 3 times, sent by the Sergeant Lieutenant back from Base A to London. One from the second year, now with the new leader of Andrew Taylor replacing Marr, to some member of his wider friendship in Canada at the 2-ounce rate, again doubly censored, another slightly unusual piece of Tabarin mail. And finally, foreign rate, threepenny rate from Operation Tabarin, difficult to find. There was little reason to write to people that were not resident either in Stanley or the UK. This one to Chile exists. It's a nice item. So it's a rare example of the threepenny rate. All kosher and correctly censored. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry it's a bit later than it should have been. I hope you have enjoyed it. And I will now take any questions.